We good? All right. So episode 7. This is, well, like I said, Days of All Our Kings. It's kind of like a soap opera, how everything just kind of goes and goes and goes, and all the little side stories and everything. We started at, this is Joshua, Judges, Ruth. This is the historical books. Excuse me. We're now down to 1 Kings. You remember in 1 Samuel, it was mostly about the prophet Samuel and Saul. 2 Samuel was most about King David's, and then King David's now almost gone. We'll see that here, and we're talking about the kings, and we'll see here Judah and Israel split off. So you have kings of Judah and kings of Israel. Okay, David is near death at the beginning of Kings, and so they want to make his life comfortable at the end, kind of like the first hospice. So they bring in a concubine named Abishag. Abishag is said to come to David to, quote, keep him warm at night. So, and she cares for him. She's basically his little nurse, you know. So instead of putting David, Daddy David in a nursing home, they hire a nurse to come and take care of him. That's basically what happens here. Adonijah, the brother of Absalom. Remember Absalom with the long flowing hair? He got killed. He would have probably been the king after David. He tried to take the throne while David was still king, and he got killed. Well, his brother Adonijah decides it's time for him to be the king. So he basically plots to steal the throne. All of David's people go with him. All the northern tribes of Israel go with him. And the exceptions were Nathan. Remember the prophet Nathan who confronted David about stealing Bathsheba away from Uriah the Hittite. He stays with David. Zadok, which is the high priest at the time, he stays with David. And Shimei. Remember Shimei? Shimei was the guy that stood at the gates when David was leaving, getting chased out of Israel. And he, you're a murderer, you're a terrible person. And then when he come back, oh, David, my king, my king, my king. He actually stays with David. So Nathan, Adonijah actually succeeds. He's basically made king, and by the northern countries, northern tribes, and he goes and just starts his rule. He starts gathering up his followers, and so Nathan sends Bathsheba in to talk to David and say, "Hey, what's up? I thought you promised the throne to Solomon, and did you know that Adonijah?" And from that, David says, "No, it's not. I want Solomon." And that's where the soap kind of begins, that little soap opera kind of thing. Who's taking power and who's not, and who's with whose wife and who's with, So that it's interesting. I really think that they should make a TV series out of this, because if you took it and put it into the modern world, and instead of kings, you have power businessmen. This is what you get. This is exactly, except for the murdering, and it's like, but I guess that can actually be in there too. So David says, no, Solomon's going to be king, and he says that Adonijah should be thrown, basically taken away. And Solomon has pity on him. He says no. Says, I won't kill you, blah, blah, blah. Come and be part of my court, and all that kind of stuff. Kind of like David did to one of Jonathan's children. But what happens is Adonijah decides to ask Solomon to marry Abisheth. Abisheth is David's nurse, David's concubine. Do you see what's happening here? By Adonijah saying, I want to marry Abisheth, he's basically making his claim to the throne again. Because, if that was David's concubine, and now she's married to me, then I have more of a right to the throne than Solomon. So, basically Solomon's a wise guy. He knows what's going on, and no more Abisheth. So, also David says, watch out for, who is it? Joab, which was one of his leaders, because Joab went with Absalom when he rebelled against David, and then he comes back to David, and then he says, watch him, and Solomon decides, hey, you're gone too. So he offs him, and then the last one is Shimei. David says, remember, he was the one that cursed me, so keep your eye on him. And Solomon makes a pact with him. He says, you are safe, I will not harm you, but you have to remain in Jerusalem forever. You can never go outside the city walls. If you go outside the city walls, that's it, it's on. And you saw what I did to the other two guys. So he agrees to that, he stays in there, and then he finds out that a couple of his people had gone astray, left him, run away, slaves, run away. So they find the slaves, and he decides he's going to personally go get them. And he leaves. And as soon as he comes back, Solomon says, you're gone.
You're done.
So all of the enemies of David are now gone, and Solomon is there ruling by himself. And then, of course, the famous thing, what made Solomon so wise is he asked God, right? He asked God. God talked to Solomon, said, I will give you anything. And instead of asking for riches or for lands or power, Solomon asked for wisdom. He says, give me wisdom to rule my land. And so God gives Solomon great wisdom. And to show that, right after he gives God wisdom, we have the story of the two prostitutes and the one baby. You know this story, right? So two women come to Solomon, come to Solomon and said, this is my baby. Because what happened was one of the mothers had, in the middle of the night, had rolled over on her baby and smothered it. And then whichever one that was took the baby and put it with the other baby and took the other woman's baby. And then now they're arguing on whose baby is the live baby. And so Solomon says, this is easy. Give me a sword. Hold the baby up. I'll hack it in two. I'll give half to each of you. And of course, the one mother goes, no. It's her baby. You know, and that's when Solomon goes, that is the real mother. Now, it doesn't really say if it was the real mother or not, but because of her attitude, Solomon said that is the true mother. So that shows Solomon's wisdom. I mean, sounds harsh, but I don't think he would have went through with it. I hope he wouldn't have went through with it. But anyway, so it just gives an example of Solomon's wisdom. So also at the same time, Solomon takes a wife from the king of Egypt. Okay, king of Egypt has a daughter, and he gives her to Solomon to be his wife. Kind of make a pact between them. See, that's what a covenant is. That's what a covenant used to be. It's like, okay, so we're going to make a pact together. You take my daughter, and she'll be your wife, and that'll give us a pact together. And that's what Solomon starts doing. Starts making pacts with all these surrounding kingdoms. The first one here is Egypt, and what we'll see is he's actually building a harem. We have a list of Solomon's officials, and I just want to point this out because if you look down through there, you'll see that the names of the officials are like Ben-Hur and Ben-Hasid and Ben this and Ben that. What the word Ben means, B-E-N, I keep on forgetting to turn word ben means son of. So whenever you see that in the Bible, if it says bin dash whatever, bin, I think there's a bin bar Jesus or bar Jesus, which bar is kind of the same thing, but it means son of. So anytime you see that, you know that it means son of in Hebrew. So that's the only reason I mention that. Okay. So guess what? Remember David wasn't going to build the temple? Okay, now God lets Solomon build the temple. He makes plans. He goes up and talks with the people at Sidon. Once again, probably makes a pact with them, and he's going to get all the Tyre. Solomon goes up. Seem to slow down. I know I got a lot to go through. Solomon goes up to Tyre and makes a pact with the ruler up there, and he brings cedar wood down. So the whole temple is going to be filled with cedar wood. And then it talks about how it's overlaid in the gold and several things like that. But Solomon makes a plan, and he knows where to get the wood now, and he comes back and he builds the temple for God. It takes him 7 years to build the temple. Okay, remember before then it was the tabernacle, and a tabernacle means tent. That's what makes me laugh when I drive past a place, nice big building that says such and such tabernacle. It's like, that's not a tent. But anyway, so it takes him 7 years to build it. And then when he gets done, he decides, oh, I need a palace now. And it almost takes him double the time to build his palace. I wonder where his priorities truly were. So anyway, 7 years to build the temple, 13 years to build the palace, and then Solomon brings the Ark of the Covenant back to the temple. Because at that time it was in the city of David, Shiloh, and so he wanted to bring it into the Ark, or the temple. Now, scholars point to this time, right? And they point that this was probably written after, we're going to get there. They go to Babylon, they get exiled to Babylon and come back. A lot of this stuff was probably written back then or rewritten how they remembered it after that. So there's a point here called the centralization of worship. Okay, that's where Jerusalem becomes the central focus. Until this point, you can go to a high place and a priest, and you can make an altar and worship God and do a sacrifice. But this is the beginning of no, you have to come here to Jerusalem, where the ark is, where God is. Okay, so there's kind of this centralization, and that's kind of like what we see so often in politics today. You got the religious, and you got the social, or the secular, and the government tries to use the religion to sway the people. Now, if they have to come to Jerusalem to worship, then what's going to happen? Well, they're going to spend money in Jerusalem. They're going to have to do everything in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem grows bigger and bigger. So, which makes it was interesting. I think originally our capital was going to be like Philadelphia or New York, and so they said no, we're going to send it down there. But anyway, back then they needed this centralization, and a lot of scholars believe that was key to growing the whole nation of Israel and Judah. But anyway, Solomon is warned by God, don't be unfaithful. And then what happens? Queen of Sheba comes. She wants to test Solomon, see if he's as smart as she's heard, and see if he's as rich as she heard. And she says, wow, he really is. And then when she leaves, remember the warning? Well, Solomon is making all these pacts, all these covenants. He's marrying all these women. Says he has 700 wives or 300 wives and 700 concubines. And the joke is David could walk down through the palace and look at one of the women and go, hey, you're one of 1,000. And mean it, right? So, so what happens is when you have all these wives, you always want to please the wives. So Solomon is starting to build temples to their gods, to his wife's gods. And then he starts dabbling in worshiping with those gods. And then God comes back. And through Ahijah, the prophet Ahijah, he says to Solomon, I'm going to tear the kingdom apart. And even though I made a promise to David that David will rule forever, you're only going to get a portion of what you could have had. So Ahijah goes and finds Jeroboam. Jeroboam isn't known before this point, but he finds Jeroboam and says to Jeroboam, you are going to be the king of Israel. And to do that, of course, prophet's got to be very dramatic. So he takes his coat and tears it into 12 pieces. And then he gives Jeroboam 10 pieces. And he says, God will give you 10 tribes to rule over and 2 tribes for Solomon. And that's how the split happens. The northern tribes are Israel. The southern tribes are Judah. So the 2 southern tribes being Judah and Benjamin, and the northern tribes, all the other 10. So that's the split. So Solomon hears about this, so he's coming after Abijah, or excuse me, Jeroboam now. So he's coming after Jeroboam. Jeroboam runs to Egypt. Egypt seems the place to go. You know, they seem like really nice people. They take in all the political refugees, right? So Jeroboam runs down to Egypt, hiding from Solomon, and then Jeroboam finally gets powerful enough, and he rises up, and he comes to the northern tribes, and they decide they make him king, and this is the official splitting of the two into 2 nations. You have Israel and Judah. At the same time, God rises up adversaries against Solomon, just to put a thorn in his side and show him that, hey, you're not being faithful to me and worshiping me alone. And then Jeroboam is sometimes referred to as the first king of Israel, even though Saul was the original king, right? But because of the split, Jeroboam sometimes from here on through the rest of the Bible is mentioned as the first king of Israel. Then what we see, one of the reasons why the people rise up and went with Jeroboam is because Solomon was taxing them to death. You built this huge temple, it took 7 years to build. You built this huge palace, it took 13 years to build. You're building all these little worship centers for all your wives. Where do you think all this money's coming from? Where do you think these tools or the supplies are coming from? So the people side with Jeroboam, and the split happens. And you can see here, what I did was in our list, all of the kings that are in red are bad kings. Bad kings. Those are the ones that went against God and his one God only. They worshipped other gods and led people astray to worship other gods. So you can see in the kingdom of Israel, all of the kings are bad from the very start, Jeroboam on. In the house of Judah, Rehoboam, we get to him in just a second. He's the son of Solomon. he is a bad king, and he's worshiping like other gods as well. Abijah, the same thing, he worships other gods, and then it's Asa and Jehoshaphat are the next in line, and they are considered good kings, and they follow the ways of the Lord, it says. So that's through the kings, first kings. Those are the kings in order, and you can see from Asa to Jehoshaphat, all those kings were in the kingdom of Israel. So they went through a really tumultuous period where everybody's getting turned over, and this person's ended up killing this person, and this person comes along and he wants to be king, and he kills the old king and becomes a new king. And so it's very, very harsh at that time. Right here, Ahab, you might have heard of him. He married a woman, her name was Jezebel. And they ended up worshiping Baal. Baal is an interesting word. You hear about it, or they call it Baal sometimes. Don't worship Baal. Well, Baal is actually the Canaanite word for Lord. So as we would say the Lord, they would say the Baal.
Where'd the golden calf?
What's that?
Wasn't it a golden?
Yep. They actually made it. That was Jeroboam. He actually, because of the centralization now, Israel couldn't go down and worship at Jerusalem, because Jerusalem now is in Judah. And so if we can't do that, then we need to go like we used to do and go to the high places, and he made all these high places. Well, he also threw in other gods, and he made a golden calf, and said, here is the God that led you out of Egypt, just like when Aaron and them did when they came out of Egypt. Very same words almost. So that's the kings, the two different nations now, Israel and Judah, and well, this guy right here. We'll start talking about him here in a second. Elijah. You've heard of the prophet Elijah. So Elijah the Tishbite. You'd remember that, the Tishbite. He goes up against Ahab. Ahab is the king of Israel now. So he confronts him for worshiping the Baals. After he does this, he runs away. So he basically comes out there and goes, you're wrong for doing this. God's going to punish you, and I'm going to run away before you kill me. So he goes out into the desert, and he meets a widow, and the widow feeds him and gives him a place to stay, kind of hides him. And one day, the widow's son is like dying. It's breathing slow, and then he ends up dying. And then Elijah goes and picks him up and raises him back to life. And so now you can see the story of Jesus, when Jesus raised the little girl and things like that. You can see why people thought, oh, this is Elijah come back. Okay? So also, there's something else I need to say. Centralization. Oh, I know what it was. So this is interesting, right? If you see, we can see a lot of the stories from this time period, and when Jesus talks about things, you can see these stories. He's referring back to these stories. So you can see why it's kind of important to understand the basics of these stories if we're going to truly understand what Jesus is saying. You know, it's kind of like watching episode 4 of the Star Wars without knowing the background to all the others, and like, why is he doing that, and why are they, what happened here? So it's like giving you the backstory to what Jesus is saying. So it's important to at least get a little bit of a grasp on what's going on here. Okay, so we're at Elijah. Elijah runs into another prophet. His name is Obadiah. Obadiah has a backstory himself. Even though he's one of the prophets to King Ahab, he goes around and he rounds up all of the other prophets of the Lord, because Ahab's got prophets of the Lord, or Yahweh, and prophets of other gods. So he rounds up the ones of the Lord and knocks the tick off. And we'll get to that part. That's when God sends fire on you. Anyway, so he takes them and he hides them. So he finds 100 prophets of the Lord and he hides them in caves, 2 caves, 50 in each. And so he saves prophets of the Lord. And that's important because later on Elijah's going to be like, am I the only one? No, Obadiah took care of that for me. So Obadiah goes and he meets Elijah, and he says, I can hide you too, basically. And Elijah says, no, you tell Ahab to come, I want to talk to him. And basically he throws down a gauntlet. He says, hey, we're going to do a challenge. I'm a prophet of God, and your prophets are not prophets at all. And we're going to have a sacrifice challenge. Okay, so they come out there, and all the priests and all the prophets of the other gods come out, and they standing in front of a big fire or a big sacrifice, ready to go, and they just need fire. And so they're trying to call down fire, and they're cutting themselves, and they're dancing, and they're acting like crazy people, and nothing happens. So Elijah goes, okay, let me show you what a real God can do and what his prophet can do. So he says, take and douse it with water. So they douse all the wood with water. He says, now dig a trench around and they dig a trench around. Now fill the trench with water. And he does that, and then he prays to God, and God sends fire down from the heavens, and poof, lights the sacrifice, burns the sacrifice, dries up all the water, and then Ahab wants to kill him again, of course. So that's showing the true prophet of God, and there's only one true God is the moral to that story. So about that time, Elisha prophesies about Ahab that, hey, you're going to die the same way that you killed some people, and your blood is going to be licked up by the dogs. So at the same time, Elisha, this is where it gets really confusing, because Elisha calls Elijah calls Elisha as the next prophet. He's going to take over when Elijah is gone. So this is the call for Elisha, and Elisha will actually go and destroy all of the priests and the prophets of all the other gods, is what the prophecy says, when Elijah calls Elisha. So there's going to be a new king eventually in Israel. His name's going to be Jehu, and Elisha are going to go and tear down all the altars to all the other gods and kill all the priests. So that's the prophecy. And then the king of the north, a king in the north of Syria, comes down and attacks Israel. And Jehoshaphat, which was the next king from Judah, joins with him and joins with Ahab, and they go up and they defeat them, and so keeping the two nations free to follow God if they want to. So you still have Israel and Judah, but during the battle, guess what happens? He's up there, Ahab's up there, he gets killed, and where he dies, it says he falls into water where, I guess this is kind of like this is the most horrible dishonor that could happen to him. It says he falls into a pool where the prostitutes come to wash themselves, and his blood spills out, and dogs come and lap it up. So, and that's basically the end of 1 Kings, where Ahab is dead. Elijah's still going strong. He's got Elisha, his new prophet, is going to come after him. And tune in next week with the next one of All My Kings. So, any questions? That's a lot. That was a lot of information. I'm sorry I didn't keep my slides going.
So what peoples are really the Judah and what peoples are really Israelites at that, Israel at that
Okay.
time?
So do you remember the map I had a couple weeks ago?
Mhm.
It's kind of like the northern tribes are Israel.
Mhm.
And there's two southern tribes that are considered Judah.
Right.
Okay, Judah, of course, is where the tribe of Benjamin, that's where Saul is from, that's where David is from, and then also that's where Bethlehem is, and then also Jerusalem. And you can see that why they wanted Jerusalem is now the central area where they're going to do all of the worship. Now you have to come to us
Right.
if you want to worship properly. And that's when in Second Kings you're going to see there's these big campaigns to go out and tear down all the high places and basically force the people to come and worship in Judah. Now some scholars question whether they're actually worshiping other gods or that false pretenses. Okay, hey, they're doing this, kind of like, hey, they've got weapons of mass destruction up there, we need to go take them out, and they never did, So, kind of like that kind of thing. They're worshiping other gods up here, so we need to go down and tear down their temples, and they might have been temples actually made to God himself, or God herself, and but they went up there and they claimed they were worshiping other gods and tore them down, forcing them to come and worship at Jerusalem, making Jerusalem the capital of all, both the north and the south, and so having power over the people. So,
And then there's the split,
yeah, the split.
where one was given two, the other one was given the rest.
Yep, the one that was given the rest, the 10, is Israel. The one that was given the 2 is Judah.
Judah, okay. I had it backwards, so I had it.
And now, it's confusing, and I gotta turn this off here, but it's confusing because it always talks about going up to Jerusalem. And in our minds, we're taught to read the map, when you go up, you're going north, right?
Right.
Well, no, they're talking about going up. Jerusalem's set up on a high place. And so when you go up, you come out of the valleys and you go up. So, or they say, we went down to Samaria. Well, wait a minute, Samaria is north of there. How do you go down to, because they come down off the high places, down into the valleys. So going up and coming down mean different things in the Bible versus the way we read maps. So, all right, you good?
Yeah.
It can be boring sometimes, but you can glean some really good stuff out of it. And you can get some stuff that will explain to you what it means, what Jesus is talking about. It makes a better understanding.
And turn on that.
Turn on